Why Study Theology by Donald G. Luck. Chapter 2. Again, why complicate things? We should focus on committed discipleship. There is an objection to theology that is closely related to the one we just examined. What distinguishes it is its stress on the importance of committed action. In part, this reflects the deep suspicion in American culture that often there is too much thinking and not enough doing. We are a nation of doers. It's no accident that inventors like Thomas Alva Edison and the Wright brothers are popular heroes. They weren't very educated, but they were creative people. Thinking has value for us primarily when it is put to good practical use. Therefore, it is not surprising that in such an atmosphere, theology seems fairly superfluous. For Americans, religious identity is usually connected to compassionate ethical activity. It's as if we are saying, if you want to know what person believes, watch what they do. Again, we need to recognize that this is a valid and helpful observation. Jesus himself said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven," Matthew 7:21. And in the most dramatic of Jesus' parables, he depicts pagans, which is to say Gentiles, being judged on the basis of loving and serving God in terms of what they have done to the lowliest person, Matthew 25:31-46. The implication of Jesus' parable is that God ultimately focuses on what persons have done, how they have been disposed toward others, not their formal belief, and certainly not any conscious theology. But the fact is that our actions and reactions are always guided by our basic beliefs. In pointing to beliefs, I am not thinking of abstract religious doctrines, although I do believe the teachings of the Church are highly influential in shaping people's lives. Instead, I am talking about the fundamental outlook we have toward life, which we use to evaluate and make sense of our experience. Like our assumptions about the Bible, this fundamental outlook is not something we are conscious of very often. It's more like a pair of glasses that sits on our nose. We may not be aware of them, but we don't see anything else without them. A sociologist has said that every one of us walks around with a basic reality kit. The kit is composed of all those hardly conscious assumptions that we have about how the world is put together, why it works the way it does, and what helps to make sense of events. What's interesting about basic reality kits is that we all take them for granted and assume that everyone sees things as we do. Yet basic reality kits are not uniform. They differ from one culture or era to another and are constantly modified by changing experience. Our fundamental beliefs are associated with our basic reality kits, but they also include our basic values, our deepest hopes, the loyalties that shape what we care about and guide what we do, and the interpretive frameworks of meaning into which we place our experience. We might call these beliefs our basic meaning kit. On July 19, 1989, the United Airlines DC-10 flight from Denver to Chicago cartwheeled and broke into fragments as it made an emergency landing at Sioux City, Iowa. Many passengers were killed, but a number survived. Days later, reporters from Life magazine spoke with some of these survivors and asked them to remember what had happened, and if they had been changed by it. The resulting article is interesting to reading. Objectively, all those interviewed went through the same incident, but existentially they experienced different events because of the filters of belief and interpretation through which this shared happening passed. Some saw their survival as a miracle, as the direct intervention of God. Others, included both an agnostic and a Christian, said that in light of the dead babies and young mothers, such notions of divine intervention were repulsive. Some indicated that the experience would make them much more attentive to religious practice, but others believed that sort of response would be hypocritical. Life's priorities have shifted for some, but others reported that life went on, very much as it had before this traumatic event. Interestingly, several Christians, a Buddhist, and an atheist all reported that their basic religious views were confirmed and deepened by the experience. Behind all of these differing reactions lie the fundamental beliefs of these different people, their assumptions for interpreting experience, their notions about what is meaningful and important, and their convictions about life and death and self and world. It isn't often that they or we are conscious of these religious beliefs, and even such a traumatic happening as this crash did not cause all the survivors to look consciously or deeply into themselves, but the reactions of each and every person were reflections of his or her basic meaning kit. A number of moves must be made from these implicit outlooks of the discipline of theology. Perhaps the most central goal of the Church's preaching and teaching ministries, its worshiping life, and its counseling is to influence the basic outlooks of people. The goal is to make Christ real and present so that in seeing him, believers see themselves and each other, their world, and the flow of their lives differently. Sometimes being busy and active is actually a way to avoid looking at life deeply or allowing basic assumptions to be challenged. Daniel Berrigan once said that the meaning of the Buddha was, "Don't just do something, stand there." It helps not to be busy all the time, to take time out, to become aware of what makes us tick at the most fundamental levels. Life-shaping events, particularly traumatic and tragic ones, can prompt us to do just that, and the Church tries to encourage this process at simple, special junctures in people's lives, such as when they become Christian converts or enter into adult church membership or seek ordination. The goal isn't merely for them to become conscious of their underlying beliefs, but to have them to be shaped by the guidance of its official teaching. To do this is to engage in theology. Certainly, theological reflection is no substitute for engaged Christian action, but because our implicit beliefs shape our identities and our responses to life, they are the key to the way we act. Taking stock of our life assumptions, doing informed and careful theology, can reshape our beliefs. Sometimes such theological reflection turns out to be the prelude to deepened discipleship, not an escape from it. God calls for faith, not doubt. Another major religious objection to theology is one that is widespread. People are nervous about the radical questioning that theology encourages. Beginning students in theology soon discover that all sorts of widespread ideas and opinions they thought to be official church teaching are challenged and even denied by those who make theology their life's work. Walking into a classroom where they assume their beliefs will be strengthened, they can discover that some of them are being undermined. The academic study of theology seems to encourage doubt. This anxiety is often tied to a suspicion that the theologians exercise a great deal of spiritual pride. By challenging, questioning, and raising doubts, they appear to place their own human intelligence above the truth of the Bible and the cherished beliefs of the past. Theology seems linked to human presumption and arrogance. In the fourth gospel, Jesus rebukes Thomas for his doubt and disbelief. It would seem he would equally rebuke the intellectual and spiritual pride of constantly questioning, doubt-inducing theologians. I have a confession to make. As a young theologian fresh from graduate school teaching in a college setting, I sometimes fell into the sin of intellectual pride and found that I enjoyed pulling the theological rug out from underneath my students. But thank God it didn't take long for life to help me outgrow this sophomoric practice. For one thing, I found that my real targets were the remnants of my own naivete, which continued to embarrass me. For another, I soon discovered as a teacher that I wasn't helping my students grow, something I wanted more than anything else. I quickly abandoned that style along with my supposition that I ought to shape my courses as if they were scaled-down versions of my graduate school education. So, it is true that human arrogance and spiritual pride can infect theology, but it is also true that they can equally be found in people's dismissal of theology. Just sense the spiritual attitude that lies behind the bumper sticker that growls, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it." A little theological clarification can help us at this point. We need to examine our working definitions of faith and doubt. Some long-standing traditions in the Christian community define faith in a way that seems to exclude the right to question Scripture, church tradition, widespread beliefs and practices, or especially what we learned at our mother's knee. Faith is often associated with notions of submission. In this view, our faith is our willingness to put ourselves under God's guidance and authority. Another viewpoint understands faith to mean the willingness to believe something to be true even though there are few or no reasons for doing so. "You've got to take that on faith," we hear people say. Add to this the use of the term faith to refer to traditional teachings of the church, as in the phrase professing the Catholic faith. Together, these definitions encourage the widespread assumption that we should unquestioningly subscribe to traditional teachings and believe them to be true even though there is little or no evidence for them. Our doubt is our arrogant refusal to do so. But if we look closely at the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, we will see that faith has a different primary meaning. It means willingness to trust God. The opposite of such faith is not intellectual doubt or the unwillingness to submit to the formal authority of the church or the Bible. Instead, it is the spiritual condition of mistrust. Faith implies that the willingness to live in the world in a state of radical risk and openness because one surrenders control of life, even one's life of faith, to God. The focus of faith, then, is not teachings or ideas, not the Bible or church doctrine, but rather the living God. Unfortunately, we are tempted again and again to complicate this posture of radical trust in God, and instead place our basic trust in things we can get a handle on. We even end up having faith in our own faith. For some of us, this means priding ourselves in our orthodoxy. For others of us, it means priding ourselves in our own sense of psychological confidence, and for others still, it means pride in our commitment to faithful discipleship. However, all these religious exercises are rivals to trusting God because in each case the object of faith is something that has to do with ourselves, and that lies within our grasp. But God is never in our grasp. That is part of the very definition of what makes God God. That's what it means to say that God is infinite. that is, not in limited finitus, as one theologian put it, but God may be at hand. That is, God may be present to us, but God is never in hand. That is why the first commandment, which stresses the supremacy of God, is followed by the second, which cautions against the creation of idols. In saying this, the Hebrew scriptures are not simply criticizing the practice of making statues. They are cautioning against confusing God with anything that is part and parcel of the finite world. Consequently, the prophets had highly critical things to say about the religious practices of their day. People were confusing them with their involvement with them, with trusting and serving God alone. The implication of all this is that our trust in God actually gives us encouragement to doubt and question. Because we do not have faith in our own faith, we can allow ourselves to be led more deeply into the truth. We need to admit, as Paul does, that our knowledge and proclamation are partial at best. 1 Corinthians 13:9. No human being can ever say that she or he possesses the truth. At best we can say we are possessed by it. Faith does mean submission to God, but that implies our submission to the truth larger than ourselves. Tennyson once wrote, "There lives more faith in honest doubt than in half the creeds." Honest doubt means the willingness to humbly place oneself under the truth. Honest questioning is submission. Ultimately, God is the author of our truth, just as God is the author of all that is. Therefore, as the great theologians of the past argued, whenever persons honestly seek the truth, they are responding to God. This is true, even if, like Socrates, they dare to question cherished traditions. An unbeliever who is a dedicated disciple of the truth is more truly God's disciple than a Christian who wants the security of absolute certainty and is afraid of asking questions. Alan Watts has some helpful insight into the dynamic and mobile character of faith. It is always on the move. That is why honest questioning may be prelude to deeper religious affirmation. He writes, "Most of us believe in order to feel secure, in order to make our individual lives seem valuable and meaningful. Belief has thus become an attempt to hang on to life, to grasp, and to keep for one's own. But you cannot understand life and its mysteries as long as you try to grasp it. Indeed, you cannot grasp it, just as you cannot walk off with a river in a bucket, but you try to capture running water in a bucket. It is clear that you do not understand it, and that you will always be disappointed, for in the bucket the water does not run. To have running water, you must let go of it and let it run. The same is true of life and of God." This means, however, that the doubt that is coherent with faith is not a cynical or arrogant dismissal of the Church's teaching. There are persons who are just as absolutist and cocksure of their atheism as there are others who have the same attitude in regarding to their religious fervor. The real issue here is whether or not persons place themselves over or under the truth. One implication is that we should not summarily dismiss the teachings of the past or the importance of the Bible. If we are truly disciples of the truth, we would be just plain foolish to ignore a wisdom and range of spiritual experience larger than our own. But faith in God does mean that we can dare to ask probing and difficult questions without feeling guilty or presumptuous. The very seriousness of our questioning is the evidence that we are asking God to lead us more deeply into the truth that in the final analysis is grounded in God alone. There are important cautions about the limits of theology, but often these religious objections, as I have chosen to call them, rest on mistaken assumptions or draw unwarranted conclusion. I admit that in trying to understand and speak in these criticisms of theology, I have actually engaged in doing some theology, which may seem to beg the question. In other words, I am using theology to defend theology. But it's important to note that disagreeing critics cannot avoid pursuing the equivalence of theology reflection and arguments themselves. Speaking for and to Christians, I would want to argue that the issue is not whether we should engage in theology. Instead, it's a question of whether we will do so in an informed and careful way. But we will still need to look closely at their objections to theology, ones that arise not so much within the church as within our culture. These are not simply objections to theology as such, but to the sort of enterprise it is, namely intellectualizing. So let's turn to what I call cultural objections next. Summary. The spirit of American activism tends to pit action against belief and make it more primary, but our basic beliefs shape how we look at life and how we respond to it. Our actions are guided by our beliefs. Traumatic events can sometimes connect us consciously with our basic beliefs about ourselves, life, the world, God. The Church encourages us to become aware of our basic beliefs and wants them to be shaped by Christ. It does this by communicating how Christian theological tradition has already made these connections. Theology is never a substitute for engaged Christian action, but theology can help us take stock of our lives and reshape the way we live in the world. It can be the prelude to deepening discipleship. Sometimes we assume that faith excludes doubt, and sometimes we are nervous about asking questions about our Christian life. We can assume that persons who dare to question are prideful, but questioning needs not to contradict faith, and an unquestioning, unthinking attitude can itself be prideful. Often, faith is identified with submission and unquestioning belief, but in Scripture it fundamentally means trusting God. Such trust is constantly threatened by our hunger for security and a sense of self-control. Unlike having faith in our faith, that is, having confidence in our own orthodoxy or sense of psychology, certainty, or commitment, trusting God encourages us to be open to the growth that can come through honest questioning. All questioning that really seeks the truth seeks God, whether it knows it or not. The unbeliever, who is a disciple of the truth, is more God's disciple than the Christian who wants absolute certainty and is afraid of questions. For further reading and reflection, after reading this chapter and thinking about what it says, what do you make of the arguments that beliefs are more fundamental than actions? What implications might this have for American religious life, which is set in a cultural fundamentally oriented to being practical? How do you respond to Berrigan's depiction of the Buddha's message? Don't just do something, stand there.